thing. Hey, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
For people who are logging in already, there's 33 of you so far. My name's Matthew Higgs, and we're going to start at 6 p.m. So we're just going to give people a minute or two to log in. And then myself and Jeffrey Meris, who you can see on the screen too, will start the conversation. So we've got another minute or so. And what I'll do with that time is I'll just move the camera around the gallery here at White Columns, and we can give people a sense of what the exhibition looks like. Okay, that's just to give you a brief sense of what the exhibition looks like in the space, if you haven't had a chance to visit yet. And it's just after 6 o'clock, so I just want to say welcome, thank you for joining us, and on Instagram Live. My name is Matthew Higgs, I'm the director of White Columns, and it's a great pleasure to be in conversation tonight with the artist Jeffrey Meris. And Jeffrey's solo exhibition is currently on view at White Columns through March the 6th. It's entitled Still Standing, and it's Jeffrey's debut solo exhibition. And Jeffrey is in his studio at Next Haven in New Haven. And we're going to have tonight's conversation via Instagram Live. So I'm just going to sort of give a brief introduction, Jeffrey, and then we'll take the conversation from there.
Yeah.
Jeffrey was born in 1991 in Haiti and grew up in the Bahamas, and received an MFA from Columbia University in 2019. And that's where myself and White Columns first encountered Jeffrey and his work. We got to see his remarkable thesis exhibition. And as a result of that, started a conversation with Jeffrey that led to a studio visit when he was in Greenpoint, and then a subsequent visit to Next Haven. This exhibition was originally planned 2020, so almost a year ago, shortly around the time the pandemic began, and the exhibition was obviously postponed for obvious reasons. And we'd also hoped in May of 2020 to present a solo presentation of Jeffrey's work at the Frieze Art Fair in New York, which of course was canceled. So obviously a lot of things have changed in the past year, and I think a lot of what's happened in the last year has in fact informed the work that's currently on view at White Columns. All of the work that's on view at White Columns was produced by Jeffrey during his artist in residency over the last year at Next Haven, and we can talk about that later. So that's the introduction. White Columns is celebrating its 50th anniversary during our 2020-21 season. The organization has been around since 1970, and its mission remains largely intact, and that's to support the work of artists who've yet to benefit from wider critical, curatorial, or commercial support. And oftentimes an artist exhibition at White Columns is their first solo exhibition. So we're honored to have Jeffrey's work here. And as I said before, it's on view until March the 6th if you get a chance to stop by. So welcome, Jeffrey. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me. And thank you all at White Columns for being so kind and thorough with the entire process so far.
Yeah, I'm not very technology friendly, so hopefully this will work. But yeah, as I mentioned, you were born in Haiti and grew up in the Bahamas, and I think that just seems to be a reasonable place to start. If you could say something about your background and growing up in the Bahamas before you came to the United States to study, initially in Philadelphia, and then after that in New York, where you now, and in the United States where you now live. So maybe if you could just sort of say something about your background, and I know that a lot of those narratives inform your work.
Yeah, first off, I want to say thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Aaron and Brittany and everyone else that works at White Columns for making this exhibition possible and for all of your assistance. And like you mentioned, that is something that I think about, these sort of shifts that happened throughout my life, and they've all been fundamental to how I understand myself in space and the sort of, I want to say reality, because I use the word politics very, very cautiously. But growing up as someone of Haitian descent in the Bahamas, right, and sort of wearing this cloak of the other, and then moving to America and being othered twice as much, has definitely informed the way that I think about my work and the way I think about myself. And I'd also add that in the Bahamas, I grew up in this tradition called Jonkanu, which is a more or less folk tradition that is super specific to the Bahamas and has its roots in the pre-Atlantic slave trade. And so this is a tradition that that survived slavery. It crossed the transatlantic slave trade, and enslaved Africans, paraded and costumed and practiced sacred traditions. And today it's a festival that incorporates various costumes and music and dancing and really using all sorts of alternate materials. So in some ways, when I think about my art and when I think about the way that I make art, it is really being informed by Jonkanu. And obviously, like going to art school and my experiences in America as well.
In an earlier interview, Jeffrey, that you made, you described the Caribbean as complicated and nuanced space, and I think your work generally, I think, seems to both sort of mirror and amplify this idea of complexity and nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And the title of the exhibition at White Columns is quite important, Still Standing. And it's taken from a poem by the Bahamian writer, activist and politician, Michael Pintard. Could you say a little bit about how you encountered Pintard's work and the significance of Still Standing, both his poem and your use of it for a title here?
Yeah, so I was 17 at the time, in my senior year of high school, when I had an English teacher, Sherelle Johnson, had us study Pintard's body of work. And it was the first time in my life, more or less, where I met someone that was working within the cultural sphere and presented to me through public education that was really pushing against ideas of xenophobia and racism and even homophobia in the Bahamas. And in some ways I saw the things that I was feeling at the age of 17 being reflected in his literature and in his poetry. And that always spoke to me. And recently I've just been falling love with poetry, and I remembered this poem, but also Still Standing, I think, also speaks like this idea of resilience and mentality, things that I'm all interested in. The exhibition opened on the 12th of January, which was sort of serendipitous. That marked the 11th anniversary of the earthquake in Haiti that claimed many, many lives. So in some ways, I think that's also a testament to the resilience of the people of the Caribbean, the resilience of the Haitian people, and I think by extension, my own resilience.
In the exhibition, all of the work in the exhibition was produced in the last year or so.
Yeah.
And, you know, two of the earliest works in the exhibition were both made in 2020 and are from your ongoing series, Now You See Me, Now You Don't. These are sculptural works that incorporate casts of parts of your own body. White Columns, one of the sculpture includes a cast of your head, and the other a cast of your feet. I'm going to turn the camera onto those works now. This is the work with a cast of your head, and its title is Just Above My Head.
Yep.
And it is on a kind of metal table structure which kind of functions as a grater, and below it are suspended lamp bases. And then the second work from this series is here, and it includes a cast of your feet. And the works have a sort of crude mechanical device which the visitor is sort of implied that they can move, and in doing so they move the object, which slowly disintegrates, and you can see aspects of that on the floor. I wondered if you could just say something about this series, because, you know, the works suggest trauma, they suggest violence against the body, in this case, the artist's body, but they also implicate the viewer in a really strange way, in the sense that the viewer is sort of implicated through the performative aspect of the work, where they're encouraged to literally destroy the body of the artist. So this idea of the artist's erasure is in some respects in the hands of the viewer. So it seems to me there's just incredibly complex set of things going on simultaneously in these works. So if you could say something about the origins of this series, or perhaps speak specifically to the works on view here.
Yeah, so Now You See Me, Now You Don't started about going on 2 years now. I was living in Harlem at the time, and I was about to take the subway, the A train downtown, and I still was not a professional subway swiper, and so I approached the turnstile to swipe my card, and I did so. And upon swiping, the machine reader said insufficient funds. I swiped a second time and it said insufficient. I swiped the first time and it said please swipe again. I swiped a second time and it said please swipe again. And the third time it said insufficient funds. And me knowing that I had paid to use the subway, but I didn't walk through, I decided to jump the turnstile. And as soon as I boarded the train, these two officers came to me and they asked me to follow them. And upon following them, I got a ticket for jumping the turnstile. And on the ticket, my height was listed as 6'7" and my weight is 250 pounds. And never in that entire instance did they ask me my height or my weight. I'm 6'2" and 180 pounds. And so I went to court. I fought the case. And in court, I realized that it was all Black and brown people facing a similar charge as me. And ironically, I was at Columbia at the same time in my MFA, and we read so much Derrida and so much Walter Benjamin, and Trenty Minha and Frank Fanon, and even Judith Butler was sort of like packed towards the end of the semester. And that's not to say that any particular individual is problematic, but instead the way that we think about these institutions is what I'm interested in. So on the one hand, I'm in this space where I'm hyper visible. I'm in court and it's packed with black and brown people, and then I'm in this other space where I feel somewhat underrepresented and invisible. And so that's really what sparked.
Jeffrey, yep.
That's what sparked the creation of these sculptures, more or less. It's just like thinking about that line between being hyper visible and invisible, and also thinking about the body as being hieroglyphic somewhat, and thinking about how my body specifically registers or engages in space. What are the things about me that I can control, right? And how do I use these casts as being surrogates, or use them as like these vessels that hold these ideas around racialization and literally destroy them. And in the exhibition at White Columns, these two just above my head, my heel, they're sort of a new departure from the older work that I was making. Those sculptures were all powered by electrical force, and that was cool, but I think there's something quite different when I ask the viewer to grind the sculpture down. It's different from just watching it happen through electric force.
Someone posted a question on the live Q&A, Jeffrey, that I'm going to paraphrase, is the idea of, is there a perverse sort of aspect of entertainment in the way that the viewer becomes performative and operates this machine, even if what the machine is doing is quite traumatic or violent?
Yeah, so I think the idea is that, right, I leave it up to the viewer to decide whether or not the sculpture is going to be completely eroded, or if it exists as merely a cast of my body. And I think it points back to like this idea that we're all implicated in the ecology of race and class and gender and sexuality. We all participate somehow.
Jeffrey?
Yep.
Okay, great. No, sometimes we get a little break in the communication between us, so I'm just making sure that it's still going fine.
Yep.
Yep. Thanks. I mean, you've mentioned it, but in these two works of White Columns, the feet and the head are casts from your body. There's a third sculptural work at White Columns that's not from the same series exactly, but it's clearly related. And it's called George, My Father's Name. I'm showing it now on screen. And it's a suspended torso, in this case, not your torso, that's pierced by these rods. And on the ground below it are rose petal leaves as a kind of memorial. And the work invokes your father, whose name I believe was George. George Floyd, who clearly was on everyone's thoughts over the last year. And as well as an obvious image here of Saint Sebastian from religion, who you told me, I think, was considered the patron saint of infectious diseases, which in times of COVID is extraordinarily pertinent. So this work shifts between the personal, the autobiographical, the universal, and this sort of slippage between past and present, but also it brings in this sort of idea of myth, mythology, religiosity. Could you say something about this work and, the circumstances in which it was made? Because it was very time specific in the sense of how it happened or came about.
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about the Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian sort of ever since I started undergrad. I would say it's always been sort of like this like myth. The myth behind the story is something I've been really invested in. And with COVID, right, we're living in this age of this airborne plague, and Saint Sebastian is the patron saint of airborne plagues, among other things, also the patron saint of homosexuals. And I thought it was really important to sort of put an earmark on that, but also thinking about George Floyd, because I think there's not one person in America last summer that did not have a thought related to George Floyd. And so I really wanted to, in some ways, make an image or make a sculpture that sort of traverse this idea of a memorial, um, but also sort of acted upon like my fascination with that particular painting. And another thing that just on a material level that happened with the sculpture was I started using copper in my practice, and well, I'd like to think that I started that's the start to something that's gonna continue happening. Materially, I really enjoyed that, and then the final thing is there's this really great scene coming to America where the King of Munda is stepping outside of the cab, and he arrives in Queens, and before he steps onto the ground, uh, these two ladies, they drop rose petals at his feet. That lives rent free in my brain, and I really wanted to sort of nod to that. So it's almost like this ghost or this image of George Floyd, you know, if I could almost throw rose petals at his feet, that was sort of, yeah.
I think in an earlier conversation, Jeffrey, with me, you described something that's happened over the last year and when you've been working in Nexthaven, and about the way that your practice has evolved. And I think you used the term, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the process of making work is being akin to writing an essay. The idea that a work of art, whether it's a painting, a sculpture, or whatever, can contain these kind of multiple layers of narrative, meaning, intention, stories, simultaneously. And I guess this work that we're looking at now, George, seems to be a great example of that, a materialization of that kind of thinking.
Yeah, so I think about literature a lot in the work that I do, because there's so much storytelling in my practice, and it all stems from this vast, or maybe not so vast, timeline. And I find that the more that I invested in my studio practice and the more work I make, I realize that everything's always so interconnected in my practice, right? So it's almost as if I'm functioning from this thesis space. And every month I sort of write a new paragraph, and I keep adding on, and the essay becomes lengthier. And every now and again, you have to reassess and sort of think about like, what are the title, what's the sort of catch in paragraph for like this particular body of work. And I think it's also just being around writers, because at Nexthaven we have two curatorial fellows, Claire and Michelle, and my relationship to them has also sort of really affected the way that I think about my work.
And before we move on, I think somebody else made a comment. I'm reading the comments from the screen, so I apologize if I'm not getting the intention of some of these comments correctly, but going back to this sort of idea of the implied violence in these works, where the viewer is put in this position of enacting a violence against these casts of your body. And I think, the word entertainment came up in a previous question that I repeated, and I think it's clearly not intended as an entertainment, is it? I mean, there's something extremely, you talk about trauma, and how in these works that suggestion of the act of destruction is left in the air. You know, I think for the most part when we go to galleries, we don't touch sculptures unless there's an explicit invitation to do so. And in these works, that invitation seems more ambiguous to me. Yeah. But it's implied.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, like sort of the fun part of it is if I see something that looks like it has a relationship to the body, right? The hand cranks almost suggest touch, or even this blue structure that you see people pushing in carts all around New York with their groceries or their laundry in it. Like so, there's or even the walker, the touch of those things, the top of those things, they're all made specific to the hand, the touch of the hand, right? So I think there's something interesting about like subverting that, or even um, the sort of implied like asking you to rethink what's your relationship to the art object. Yeah, I think it's cool to sort of be in that ambiguous space of whether or not this should be touched.
Yeah. One of the recent developments in your practice, and it's sort of central to the exhibition at White Columns, is a group of recent paintings, and you use the term paintings for these works.
Yes.
The works are made from accumulations of rust-soaked rags and stretched on frames that, in the manner of how we might see, say, animal skins stretched. Some of them have titles that refer specifically to the body or to flesh. One's called Scar Tissue, which I think we're looking at now.
Yeah.
Another is called Shroud. Another is called First Aid. The origins of this series were quite serendipitous, and it began in New York, but then really developed when you moved to Nexthaven. Could you just say something about the origins of this series, and then sort of go beyond that to your subsequent thoughts about these works? And whilst you're doing that, I will show everybody what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I made Now You See Me, Now You Don't primarily towards the end of my time in grad school at Columbia, and I was faced with the age-old problem that probably every person that goes to grad school and made a bunch of work has to do. Like, what do you do with it? And I decided to put everything in storage, and I was very poor, not that I'm very rich now, but I got a very bad storage unit in the south of New Jersey. And so I drove all this work that's made of steel into a storage unit that was not climate or humidity controlled. And I sort of just forgot about the work in New Jersey. And at the start, just before I started Nexthaven, I picked everything up out of storage. And essentially my sculptures were all covered in rust. And I spent the next 2 months after getting them out of storage just caring for those works and cleaning them off with the cotton terry rags. These are painter's rags that you're looking at, old t-shirts and pieces of fabric that soaked in acid and then used to wipe off the rust. And I realized in cleaning off those sculptures that I was not trying to store the sculptures, but I was actually making work. This also coincidentally was around the time of the start of the pandemic, and this notion of care or self-care started to become more prominent in my practice. So these paintings became very important because my practice started to shift away from this trauma, violence gaze that was happening in the sculptures, and started to become more about healing and restoration and cleansing, not a lighter sense of cleaning. And I also started to realize that around the time that I was making these paintings, ecology and chemistry and this more scientific way of thinking about the work also became very important to me, because rust is really a chemical reaction in the same way that iron and oxygen exist in rust, it also exists in the blood. So thinking about these different themes started to pop up in the work, and now that's the direction that the work is more or less going in. And the work that you're looking at right now is called Thicker Water, and the reference to is blood. On the blue fabric, that's the periodic full of elements, and layered on top of that is the uh, chemical formula for hemoglobin. So just thinking about ways to sort of further expand the work is where I'm at.
One of the rust paintings, which we're looking at now, incorporates a line from Octavia Butler's 1998 novel, Parable of the Talents. And the line that you included, which I'm showing everyone now, reads, "Love their country and their God." Can you just talk a little about, your relationship to that text, to that novel, and how those words found their way into this piece?
Yeah, this is making me really happy because I'm thinking about Tamashi Jackson right now. I went to Skowhegan. Shout out to Tamashi and to Skowhegan. I went to Skowhegan with Tamashi 2 years ago, and last summer Tamashi started a reading group. We started with Parable of the Sower, and then we went on to Parable of the Talents. But and essentially write America in this Parable of the both the parables, these novels that are about a post-apocalyptic America in some ways. It's science fiction, and it's set in the early 2020s, even though this book was written in the 90s. And in the Talents, specifically, it follows the story of America that becomes like this Christian fundamentalism is super, like this nationalistic Christian fundamentalism. And basically, if you're not Christian, you're sort of enslaved and persecuted by the government. And the president, Steele Jared, he makes it okay for all of this stuff to happen. And so this idea of God coming up and this idea of love of country, and how the two of these things sort of merge together. And the main character of the book in the Talents Lock, also along with Lauren, they're sort of chasing an alternate religion called Earthseed that believes that the destiny of man is in the sky. So the goal is to leave Earth and go to space. But Jared sees them as being pagan. And the whole campaign, and this is the weird thing about that book. The book was written in the 90s, I believe. And and Jared's whole campaign promise in Parable of the Talents is make America great again.
That's amazing.
So that sort of like really messed with me, and I thought that was really smart, but I also just wanted to sort of like put in some of the things I was reading into the work. And another thing that I think is like really beautiful about this piece, God and Country, is the fact that I started to move away from just rust, the white fabric, the white part of the painting. Also painter's rags, but this time instead of cleaning steel, what I did was I cleaned aluminum. So all of the paintings in this exhibition, I build all of the aluminum structures and the wooden frames that the fabric is stretched around. And the surface of the aluminum is hand brushed. First it's sanded and then it's hand brushed. Welded, sanded, and then hand brushed. And what that means is it's really a lot of work. And the final step is polishing all of that aluminum. And so you polish it with something like Brasso and rags. And so the white on that fabric is really that's the aluminum that's being rubbed off. And again, going back to like how science, right? Steel, iron, aluminum, copper, these are all basic elements, metals. And so I'm interested in the ecology of that.
In talking to you previously, Jeffrey, and in interviews, you've suggested that your figurative works, like the works from Now You See Me series, Now You Don't, are ultimately centered around trauma, and I'm quoting you now, trauma in a sense of racially based violence. Whereas the paintings that are on display at White Columns, and I'm quoting again, you say display rituals of care, healing, and the cleansing of these wounds, which you've clearly addressed in terms of this idea of literally cleaning. Mm-hmm. Can you expand upon this idea of healing as it relates to this recent painting series?
Yeah, so I think like when I think about how every day most of us, we go home and we shower, right? And that's sort of like a regenerative space. We take care of the body, we wash our skin and we clean our hair and we brush our teeth, and it makes us feel revived. And so in some ways I think about those gestures of care. Those are rituals really that are all societally ingrained to us, and they mean something. They carry significance. Uh, so I'm really thinking about the cultural value of that, and how do I take that cultural value and that cultural resonance and perform that same act of care and awareness and kindness to those sculptures, because I'm it's not lost on me that those sculptures are very hard to live with. It's hard to see something anthropomorphic being destroyed that way. So in some ways, I think about the paintings as being the space to be kind, or softer in my practice and softer in my work with the materials and my way of thinking about them. And I also think another thing that I want to just say is that healing isn't always clean. It's not always clean, not always sublime, and it's not always divine, right? We live in a political world where people are saying we need to heal from the past and let January 6th go. But right, it's not a linear process. It's like you have to go through the mucky, messy, muddled thing in order to arrive to that metal.
And then, of course, they also play a kind of disruptive, or have a disruptive relationship with, the history of gestural painting and the history of, certain tendencies in American post-war art. I mean, I think clearly you're riffing on that too.
Yeah, I'm becoming a painter.
You'll be buying some brushes before you know it.
Who would have thought?
You're speaking to us from your studio in New Haven at the extraordinary Next Haven Artist Residency Program. I wonder if you could just say something about your time there, especially given that your time there coincides exactly with the time of COVID, and also how the time you had there, or the time and space Next Haven provided, impacted on the day-to-day work in the studio, but also on the nature of the work you've produced. Because, even though the work I think is very consistent with the kind of work you've been making over the last couple of years, this work feels very present in a present tenseness sense. And you've already addressed that.
Yeah.
In terms of how these works relate specifically to what's going on around us now.
Yeah. Matthew, can you go to the half and half?
Yeah. So what we're looking at now for the viewers is the first work you see when you come into Jeffrey's exhibition. And it's a large kind of metal warehouse door that Jeffrey has split in two. And I'll let Jeffrey take it from there.
Yeah, so this sculpture, half and half, was actually the very first work that I made when I came. It even used to be a warehouse during the industrial movement. Sort of, New Haven was this very industrious city, and so it was a warehouse, and this door was being thrown maybe on my second day of being in Next Haven. And for those of you that were with us at the very start of this conversation, that's 6'7", 250-pound operation, that myth that's being created of me. I think about the sculpture as being that it being that, me using that as a prompt to create the sculpture, but also thinking about other ideas around that and sort of balance as well. And so in a way, formally, I think Next Haven is definitely impacted in practice, but also just having the space and the time to really sort of move through ideas. And something that I came into this fellowship with is the idea of levity, right? What would levity look like in practice and in my life, right? And how to operate from a space of abundance and fullness instead of lack, and instead of lack, because like a lot of times you're an artist and you're also African diasporic. A lot of times you sort of feel like that's the corner that you're being pushed into. And so for me, it really was about expanding this idea, and I'm really just looking over the work in the last few weeks. I think I'm really coming towards the space of like thinking about ecology, thinking like the fullness of ecology, or ecology in terms of what it means from the human condition, from my own sort of perspective. Also thinking about chemistry and also thinking about embodiment. So these are the practices, and again, going back to like these ideas of growth and healing. And just really quickly, I'm going to show you all a piece that I'm working on in my studio right now that I think embodies a lot of the things that that are happening, or that began and still standing, but is now sort of going into another direction. So this is just sort of where my studio practice is right now. Obviously, it's super empty because everything's at white columns. So yeah.
And what's happening next, Jeffrey? What's on the horizons for you? How long can you stay at Next Haven? Has that changed because of the nature of the pandemic? And beyond Next Haven, what are your next exhibitions, your next plans, or where do you see things in the next year or so?
Yeah, so Next Haven has definitely been very kind, and around sort of the peak of the peak of the first wave of COVID in New York, Next Haven extended us for another 5.5 months. And so I have about another 3 months and change here. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be about just coming to the studio and enjoying the process. I have an apprentice. As a part of Next Haven, we each have an apprentice who we mentor throughout the course of the program. My apprentice, Emo Langola, he's the most amazing kid. I really look forward to really spending more time with him as we start the work. And in terms of projects, Next Haven's group show is in June at James Cohen, so you guys can definitely look out for that. And
that's an exhibition of all the current residents of Next Haven where you'll show together.
Yeah, curated by Claire Kim. So that's coming up, and I think oddly I'm being pushed back down south to New York. I'm gonna be at Triangle Arts in the summer, and there's some projects, Jose Mesra in the fall. So something.
And I know that fairly recently you exhibited in Nassau in the Bahamas in an exhibition curated by Tavares Strachan. And what was it like to show in the place that you grew up? I don't know how often you exhibited your work in the Bahamas.
Well, there's a lot of people there that support me, and I'm grateful for that community. But it's definitely been it's been a long time since I did anything there, and so it almost felt like a homecoming.
Yeah.
Definitely being in conversation with Tavares, and he's just been such a great mentor and support of my practice and my work, and being able to hold fellowship with him, and Stan Burnside is also really great. The exhibition was Astro Projects, and Jose's also very, very kind. Me and him will be doing a project later in the fall together.
Great.
Yeah, and it was just nice to be in really good weather.
I can hear that.
And go to the beach.
Well, Jeffrey, thanks for taking the time out the studio to do this with us. We're thrilled. I know that there's so much more to talk about with individual works, with the practice as a whole, with the exhibition specifically here at White Columns. But if anybody is in the city in the next month, the exhibition is on through March the 6th. The gallery is open Tuesday through Saturday, noon until 6 p.m. Just usual social distancing. You don't need to make an appointment. Please stop by if you get a chance. We're located right by the Whitney Museum if you haven't been to White Columns' new home. And, you know, we wish Jeffrey all the best in New Haven. Excited to see what comes next. And for the moment, we're thrilled to be hosting your first solo exhibition. So thanks, Jeffrey. It's really appreciated. And thanks to everybody who posted comments and questions. Sorry if we didn't get a chance to address them all. I don't always notice that they're scrolling by, but we really appreciate your input too.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Good night.